He frustrated conservatives. Justice Kennedy was the third nominee to fill the seat back when he was nominated in 1987, because the first two nominees, Robert Bork, was voted down in the Senate, and then Douglas Ginsburg, a federal appeals court judge, had to withdraw his nomination. So in some ways, he was kind of seen as a consensus pick, someone that could get confirmed, and he was confirmed in 1988. And then he got on the court, and he began issuing a number of conservative decisions, and he was quite conservative this term, Jeff, by the way. And remember, he did write that very impassioned dissent in the Obamacare case when the court, with John Roberts, voted to uphold President Obama's signature achievement. But I think the message here, the takeaway here, is that he's considered a swing vote. He was the key vote in refusing to overturn Roe versus Wade. He was with liberals on a number of other of those social issues. He would always, if not voting with liberals on those social issues, he also would kind of constrain the bolder conservatives on the court. So they may be willing to go much further. They say, you know, let's end affirmative action or greatly scale back abortion rights. And Justice Kennedy was always there kind of pulling them back a little bit. The key to understanding him, many people have speculated, is that, you know, he would just never say never on some of those social issues. And now we may well have a nominee who's willing to be a little more bold.
So, Jan, the Scalia seat was open for 14 months. How long would you expect this seat to remain vacant for?
Not that long. I mean, I would expect you will see a new justice nominated by President Trump and confirmed by the Senate over the summer and in place to hear arguments when the justices return from their recess the first Monday in October. And there will be very little Democrats can do about it.
Okay, Jan Crawford from D.C., we will see you with much more on this story tonight on the CBS Evening News. Jan, so much to discuss with the seismic news from the Supreme Court this afternoon, the retirement of Justice Kennedy, long a swing vote. We'll have much more on this on your local news, also on our streaming network, CBSN, and tonight on the CBS Evening News. Again, the news from the Supreme Court, Justice Kennedy is retiring. For now, I'm Jeff Glor, CBS News in New York.
For news 24 hours a day, go to cbsnews.com.
Dahlia Lithwick joins us now. She's a contributing editor at Newsweek and a senior editor at Slate. Dahlia, what is your interpretation of this news? Are you surprised at all? There had been rumors swirling that the justice might retire.
Yeah, I don't think it was a surprise. I think we knew he wanted to go a year ago. We were all ramped up, ready for that. I think that there were a few issues he felt he wanted to resolve that he'd been thinking about for decades. He hung out for a year to resolve them. And I think it is not a surprise at all. He's 81. It's fairly clear from his decisions at the end of this term, just in the last couple of weeks, that he's done what he needs to do and he's ready to go. So I think in some sense the surprise was that he stayed a year beyond when he told us he pretty much wanted to go.
What do you think were those unresolved issues that he wanted to address before retiring?
Well, interestingly, I think the big one was gerrymandering. He'd been waiting for decades to find what he called a justiciable standard for what would be an unconstitutional partisan gerrymander. And then, interestingly, in the Gill case, he decided not to decide. He had two vehicles this term that could have been that. The court kicked those away. And so if that's the thing he wanted to get sorted after decades of waiting and seeing, waiting for the perfect vehicle, he actually didn't get that done. I also think he probably wanted to stay on a year to try to resolve the travel ban case that came down yesterday, and he proved to be the fifth critical vote to uphold Donald Trump's travel ban.
Dahlia, we're going to hold you right there. If you could just stand by for us. We're going to bring in CBS News chief legal correspondent Jan Crawford, who's joining us now from Washington. Huge news, Jan, but as you said earlier, not entirely a surprise. What do you think this means for the future of the court, given the fact that he was such a critical swing vote?
Well, I mean, listen, I don't want to overstate the idea that Kennedy was some moderate conservative, you know, who was kind of we never really knew what he was going to do. I mean, at the end of the day, he was a conservative, but he did have that kind of libertarian streak. So he made a number of key rulings on some of those social issues, siding with liberals. And so as a result, that's why you saw him voting as he did on abortion and on gay rights. And then he would also kind of restrain some of the bolder conservatives. I don't think we're going to get a nominee who's like that. I think President Trump is going to put on a strong conservative, someone who's in the mold of, say, a Justice Scalia or now Justice Thomas, a Justice Alito. That's what he's going to be looking for. Those are all the nominees already that we believe are on the short list. That will change the Supreme Court. It will move the court more solidly to the right for a generation.
How easily and quickly do you think a justice will be confirmed, a nominee will be confirmed, especially given what happened last time when Senate Democrats tried to block Gorsuch?
I think it'll be very easy to get a nominee confirmed, and it'll happen very quickly. And there's very little the Democrats can do about it because they made the decision to filibuster Neil Gorsuch, who was replacing a staunch conservative, the late Justice Antonin Scalia, on the Supreme Court. That enabled Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, to kind of blow up the filibuster with Republicans on board, even moderate Republicans on board. I don't think it would have been as easy to blow up the filibuster for this nominee. What I do believe now, what we're going to see is this nomination is going to turn on the kind of the hands of the moderate conservatives who are in the Senate. I mean, if it's okay with Susan Collins or Lisa Murkowski, that's who the nominee is going to be. They're going to be the restraining voices for this nomination, not the Democrats.
Do you expect this confirmation to happen before the midterms, before more Democrats may come in?
Absolutely. That we can say with certainty. And I do believe you will have a new justice on the Supreme Court for the first Monday in October.
Jan Crawford, thank you so much. CBS News Chief White House correspondent Major Garrett joins us now from the North Lawn of the White House. Major, the president will now have a chance to nominate a second justice to the court. How significant is this, especially given what happened during the Gorsuch nomination?
Well, it's enormously significant. It's one of the most significant powers any president possesses. And with Neil Gorsuch, President Trump indicated that he would look for conservative jurists in the mold of Antonin Scalia. He will look for someone very similar to Neil Gorsuch as the nominee, be that person a man or a woman. And as Jan accurately summarized just a second ago, that nominee is likely to receive a very favorable embrace from the Senate Republican leadership and the Senate Republican rank and file. Those confirmation hearings will be scheduled rapidly, they will be conducted, and a vote will be held in the midterm election atmosphere. That will have two consequences, both of them political. We'll get to the legal consequences in a second, but the politics of this is extremely important. The second Trump nominee to the High Court will be a galvanizing call to Republicans to support Republicans on the ballot in Senate and House races in the midterms. This is, in essence, from Justice Kennedy, a political gift to the Republican Party and President Trump, because one issue has been a galvanizing and motivating component for base Republicans throughout, and it's been the future of the Supreme Court, the future of the federal bench generally. President Trump refers to it repeatedly. It was a significant aspect of his victory in 2016. If you look at the exit polling data about how many Trump supporters identified the Supreme Court as the most important or among the most important issues, those numbers, depending on the state, ranged from 20 to 25, in some cases 30%. It was a big motivating factor then. It will be in 2018. On the other side of the political aisle, we have kind of a constellation of legal issues lately that have certainly grabbed the attention of Democrats, and the future of the Supreme Court will motivate them even more. There will be tremendous pressure on Democrats to do whatever they can to resist. They will probably fail in that resistance, but it will also be used in midterm elections for Democratic voters and possibly Democratic-aligned independent voters. Look at what's happening to the legal construct of our country. Look at what's going on. You've got to vote Democrat if you want to slow that down, and you've got to think more holistically, if you will, about the future of the federal bench in not just midterm elections in 2018, but for the presidential election in 2020. So one thing that Jan knows all too well is that the court itself and its future is no longer limited to debates about legalisms, stare decisis, precedent, and all those sorts of other legal terms. It's also about politics, motivational politics, base politics on both sides. And Justice Kennedy's announced retirement will be a galvanizing force for Republicans and Democrats in the midterm elections.
And how much will this validate the president himself? We saw yesterday when the Supreme Court sided with the president on the travel ban. That really pumped the president up in terms of his belief that he was right all along. If we have another justice that was nominated by the president on the bench who made side with the president, of course, each justice looks at the legal constraints on each decision. But if we do see another nominee, another justice on the bench who was nominated by the president, how will that affect the president himself and his feeling feeling behind his own decisions?
Well, the travel ban, it's important to remember, was okayed by the Supreme Court in its third variation. I don't think it's clear, based on reading the court's decision, even by that narrow 5-4 majority opinion, that would have been an endorsement from the Supreme Court's point of view constitutionally of either travel ban 2 or travel ban 1. So the president had to significantly alter his orientation to that issue to win Supreme Court approval. That's, of course, why they did it. So that is always something worth underscoring in the travel ban case. Yes, it was vindication, but it came after the third variation trying to interpret what the president wanted to accomplish. Look, the president's point of view about the Supreme Court is very much consistent with that of so-called judicial conservatives who want jurists on the federal bench at the district court level, the appellate court level, and the Supreme Court that have a narrow interpretation of constitutional evolution. They want things consistent with precedent, but they're not interested in expanding the reach or definitions of what is legal under the Constitution, introducing new protected classes or new protected behaviors. They want to be very constrained and as close as possible, as they would argue it, to the original, what they call the original intent of the Constitution. That's the president's framework. He has, if you will, subcontracted most of that work to something called the Federalist Society, which has been in Washington for more than 30 years. Jan is very familiar with it, as are any of the legal experts in Washington, and they have this view. They have spent 30 years quietly, consistently at law schools, on federal benches, on state benches, trying to recruit those who have a like-minded approach to the law and the Constitution. This organization, the Federalist Society, has now provided many, if not most, of the names submitted to this White House for nomination, either to lower federal court appointments and nominations or to the high court. And the president, President Trump, has essentially invested this group almost solely with the power to judge who is and who is not suitable for nomination by this White House. It's not a direct conduit from the Federalist Society to the federal bench, but it is a very influential conduit. And that organization will have a great deal of influence on shaping those on the short list for this Supreme Court vacancy and whoever it is the president ultimately nominates.
Speaking of that short list, the president has just said, while appearing with the president of Portugal, that he will immediately begin the search for a new Supreme Court justice. He said that person will come from the previously released list of 25 candidates. What do we know about this list and who's on it, Major?
Well, you can easily find it. I can't give you all 25 names. It's easily locatable. Just Google it. What's important about the list is that it is the third variation of a list that candidate Trump propounded during the campaign. And it was a novelty. It was completely brand new for someone to say, you know what, I'm developing a list for Supreme Court. And then as that second list came out, that candidate, Donald Trump, unlike anyone for either party, said, that's the list. I will pick, if I'm elected, from that list, and I'll introduce nobody else. So you can appraise me as a potential president and the Supreme Court based on this list I'm giving you to evaluate. That was a signal during the campaign from Donald Trump to judicial conservatives and all Republican-minded voters who cared about the future of the Supreme Court. Here's my list. I'm taking it seriously. I vetted this list. You can vet the list. And if you like it, maybe you'll support me. It was an innovative approach to combining politics and the future of the Supreme Court, and it worked. And from that list, the president has developed credibility on this issue with these base Republican voters. And that list is a reinforcing mechanism in his conversation with them about the future of the court. So, like I said, you can find all 25 names online. That's easy to do. The more important thing is this list is real. It has been the wellspring from which the president has chosen not just Neil Gorsuch, but others to high positions on the federal bench. So it's part and parcel of what then candidate created as a unique conversation on this topic in a real-time political context. He deserves, if you are looking in the history of American politics, credit for innovation, because nobody had ever done that before. And I've talked to a lot of Republicans who can't imagine a scenario long after Donald Trump has left the political stage in America in which a Republican seeking the presidential nomination will not do a similar thing. Have a Supreme Court list and say, I vetted it, now you can vet that list, and in the process, vet me, as a way of deciding whether or not I'm worthy of your support. In this one respect, on the politics of the law and the politics of the judiciary, Donald Trump was innovative, and it worked for him.
Thank you so much, Major Garrett. We did just show that list of other potential nominees, and we are waiting to hear from the president, who is making remarks at the White House while he meets with the president of Portugal. Let's bring back Ilya Shapiro. He's on the phone with us. He's a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. Ilya, how critical is this timing, especially ahead of the midterms?
Well, you put your finger on it. I don't know how much of a calculation this was for Kennedy, but certainly given the chance that the Democrats could take the Senate in November, this allows the President Trump and the Republican majority in the Senate to fill that seat. And so this is very different than had he waited another year, because I think given the Gorsuch precedent, I don't think we'll ever see a justice confirmed to a seat by a Senate of the opposite party to the White House, certainly not in the last year before the election, and probably even longer than that. So the timing is auspicious, and Mitch McConnell, especially the last week or two, has been giving a lot of interviews talking about how judges is the biggest part of his legacy. I think that's absolutely right, and here he gets a chance to gild that lily, and President Trump could go down as very influential, not for anything that he makes news for or tweets about, but simply for the opportunity to appoint, well, now a second justice and a significant number of the lower courts, and that's for life. That's regardless of whether he leaves the White House now in 2 years, in 6 years, or anything else.
Ilya, when we were speaking earlier, we were talking about the letter that the justice gave to the president announcing his retirement. He said that his decision is effective July 31st this year, so there's no chance he's going to wait until there is a replacement in place. How typical is this for him not to extend his retirement but really make it definitive?
It's dependent. Different justices have done it in different ways. Justice O'Connor announced that she would leave when her successor was confirmed, so that allowed kind of a seamless transition to Justice Alito in the middle of that particular term. Other justices have said immediately. I think when Thurgood Marshall announced his retirement, he was the last one to actually announce it in open court the last day of the term, which would have been this morning when they were announcing their last opinions. At the end of that, announced that he was retiring immediately. Here, something in between those two options, saying, I'll give it a month. But that really, given that it's the summer, it's no different than if he had announced that he's retiring immediately. So the different justices do it in different ways. But this gives the whole summer, and the court's not due to pick up again until early October, gives all of that time to pick a nominee, to hold hearings, have a confirmation vote. So there's time to have kind of the normal kind of process that we did not obviously see after Justice Scalia's death.
Is there any chance that this seat will be vacant like it was after Scalia died, or is that chance gone now that the filibuster mechanism has been disbanded?
It depends on pure chance and numbers. Presumably, whomever President Trump picks, his staff will have run it by sort of the most moderate members of the Republican caucus, Susan Collins of Maine, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. John McCain's health, would he be able to make it back? or will, it's not inconceivable that Mike Pence would have to break a tie vote. But yes, assuming that those more moderate swing, if you will, Republican Senate votes are on board, then given the no filibuster, this should be smooth sailing.
And Ilya, how do you think his departure will impact Chief Justice John Roberts?
Well, Roberts will gain in power. The Chief Justice is, of course, only one of the 9 votes. He doesn't get more votes than that. He does have an assignment power. When he's in the majority, he can pick who gets to write the opinions, and there's some administrative tasks. But now he will almost certainly become the very middle of the court, meaning 4 justices will be to his left, 4 will be to his right, ideologically, not just logistically in terms of how we look at the court where they physically sit. So if some people have been calling the court the last decade or so the Kennedy court because the retiring Justice Kennedy has been the swing vote on so many issues, now the Roberts court, named after the Chief Justice, will also be the Roberts court in terms of who has the position of power.
Ilya, thank you so much. Just to recap what we've been learning, of course, Justice Anthony Kennedy has announced his retirement. This is the letter that he sent to President Trump saying that his... Before we do that, let's listen in to Mitch McConnell, who's making remarks.
I suggest the opposite of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
This all happens the day that Justice Anthony Kennedy announces his retirement. This is a letter that he gave to President Trump saying that effective immediately, July 31st, he is retiring. Now, this was something that had been rumored, but the timing is very interesting. Let's bring in Dahlia Lithwick. She's a contributing editor at Newsweek and a senior editor at Slate. Dahlia, how key was his vote? He was considered the justice most likely to be a swing vote.
He was without doubt, to the extent that anybody swung, it was him. He kind of inherited that mantle from Sandra Day O'Connor. Historically, she had been the 5th deciding vote one way or another, and when she retired, he without a doubt became the person on the court most likely to make up the 5-4 in one direction or another. I think Jan Crawford made the point, and I think it's right, that didn't make him a centrist. It made him a very conservative justice who on occasion, particularly on areas that were really important to him, gay rights, women's reproductive rights, affirmative action, would sometimes align himself with the 4 justices on the left. So to the extent that we don't have that person after July 31st, I think that's accurate. It's a big, big seat to fill.
Now, he was nominated by a conservative president, but is this a blow to Democrats?
Well, I think it's a tremendous blow to Democrats, both insofar as he will, without a doubt, be replaced by someone far to his right, someone much more like Neil Gorsuch than like John Roberts. So I think it's a blow in that sense. I think it's also a blow in that there is a legacy here. There is an enormous legacy in which Anthony Kennedy held the court in check in terms of overruling Roe v. Wade, in terms of not allowing marriage equality. There was in area after area, he was the decisive vote, and I don't think it's overstatement to suggest that all of those areas of the law in which he was the decisive 5th vote are now going to be up for grabs.
Dahlia, thank you. We want to take you now to the White House, where moments ago the president addressed the retirement of Justice Kennedy. Let's listen in.
That I've respected for a long time. He's been a great justice of the Supreme Court. He is a man who is displaying great vision. He's displayed tremendous vision and tremendous heart. And he will be missed, but he will be retiring. And we will begin our search for a new justice of the United States Supreme Court that will begin immediately. And hopefully we're going to pick somebody who will be as outstanding. So I just want to thank Justice Kennedy for the years of tremendous service. he's a very spectacular man, really a spectacular man. And I know that he will be around hopefully for a long time to advise, and I believe he's going to be teaching and doing other things. So thank you to Justice Kennedy. Okay. Thank you.
Who will be picked to replace him? Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Well, we have obviously numerous people. We have a list of 25 people that I actually had during my election. I had to 20, and as you know, I added 5 a little while ago. We have a very excellent list of great talented, highly educated, highly intelligent, hopefully tremendous people. I think the list is very outstanding. When I was running, I put down a list of 20 people, because not being a politician, I think people wanted to hear what some of my choices may be, and it was pretty effective. And I think you see the kind of quality that we're looking at when you look at that list. But I added 5 additional people to the list. So it will be somebody from that list. So we have now boiled it down to about 25 people.
So when did you find out? To the World Cup with President Putin to the final?
Yes, no, I will tell you, we fought very hard to get it here. I think they're doing a fantastic job with the World Cup right now. It's in Russia, and I will tell you that it's exciting. My son loves soccer, and he loves watching the World Cup, and they have really done a fantastic job with the World Cup. It's exciting, even if you're a non-soccer fan. I'm a soccer fan a little bit, but I don't have much time. But, well, I'm rooting for everybody to do well. But I think the venue has been fantastic. They really have shown something very special. I fought very hard to get it for the United States, Mexico, and Canada, as you probably have heard, and we were honored to be chosen. And this is a great gentleman and a great soccer fan, too. But we were very honored to be chosen for the World Cup, so we look forward to that.
President will be meeting to the U.S., and where?
Most likely. John Bolton is over there now. He's over in Russia right now. I just saw, watching media, that he's met with President Putin. I haven't gotten the full report yet, but it would look like we will probably be meeting sometime in the not-too-distant future. And I've said it from day one, getting along with Russia and with China and with everybody is a very good thing. It's good for the world, it's good for us, it's good for everybody. So we'll probably be meeting sometime around my trip to Europe.
Do you know where?
Hasn't been determined yet. Probably I will know within an hour.
And what about the injunction on immigration? Will you fight that? The California judge, he says reunited families must be put together.
Well, we're going to see, but we believe that families should be together also. So there's not a lot to fight, but
how do you
we believe families have to be together. But what we really do is we believe in very strong borders, no crime, and the Democrats believe in open borders and plenty of crime, because that's what you get with the open borders. I would like to introduce, however, the president of Portugal, and I'm sorry to bother you, but in our country, the selection of a justice of the United States Supreme Court is considered, I think we can all say, one of the most important events, one of the most important things for our country. I mean, you see the decisions that just came down, how big they are, how vital they are. And they can swing different ways depending on whom there might be in the court. So it's always been considered a tremendously important thing. Some people think outside of, obviously, war and peace, it's the most important thing that you could have. But another very important thing is introducing the president, the highly respected, I must say, president of Portugal. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, President. Well, as a constitutional law professor, I know how important it is when a justice in your Supreme Court retires, because it's a key institution for the country. So I just heard the news, and I imagine how important it is for you and for any United States president. Anyway, I'd like to tell you that we have a long-lasting friendship and partnership.
Yes.
That started the moment we recognized you.
That's right.
We were the first neutral country to recognize the United States of America's independence. Although we had as our oldest ally England. So it was courageous at that time.
That's right.
And I don't know if you know it, but your founding fathers celebrated independence with our wine, with Madeira wine. They made a toast.
Good taste. With
our Madeira wine. It's a long, long story, this one, about friendship and partnership, based on common values, of democracy and freedom and rule of law and human rights, but also of a very strong community. A fellow citizens that are both American and Portuguese, and they love the United States of America, and they love Portugal. There are around 1,500,000 Portuguese, Luso-American living here.
That's right.
They're very important. So it's not just a military, political, and economic alliance. It's more than that. It's something very human, because we're speaking of 1,400,000 people that they live their love for two countries at the same time. As you spoke of soccer, let me then ask you something, well, make you a suggestion.
Go ahead.
If you're going to meet Mr. Putin, well, I was with him last week.
Good.
Yes, and he asked me to greet you. So, of course, he was expecting your visit. But anyway, don't forget that Portugal has the best player in the world. That is called Cristiano Ronaldo.
Oh,
I'm sure your son knows it.
He knows all about it.
And so, don't forget, if you ever go to Russia during the championship, don't forget Portugal is still there and wanting to win.
That's right, doing very well.
Yes.
That's right. And they say he is.
And doing very, very, very well.
That's very good. And so tell me, how good a player is he? Are you impressed?
I'm very much impressed. He's the best player of the world, Cristiano Ronaldo. So in a sense, well, I think has been a success. I do agree with you.
Yeah,
the
great.
championship.
Yeah, great. Yeah. I think
no doubt about it, for the world, for the world.
So will Christian ever run for president against you? You wouldn't win. You know he won't.
President, you know something I must tell you. Portugal is not just the United States.
That's right.
It's a little bit different.
I agree. Yes, go ahead.
Mr. President, when did you learn that Justice Kennedy was retired?
About a half hour ago.
Were you surprised?
He came to the White House. We had a wonderful discussion just prior to meeting the president, and really had a very deep discussion. I got his ideas on things, including I asked him if he had certain people that he had great respect for that potentially could take his seat, which is a very hard seat to fill. So we talked about different things, and he was here for about a half an hour. I don't think you folks saw him come in and out, did you? I'm shocked. Boy, they've done a great job. That's a shocker. That's a shocker. But yeah, we had he just left a little while ago, just prior to meeting the president.
Will you tell us who he recommended? Will you give us any?
No, I won't do that. But he has, there are certain names that are just outstanding. Names that you already know, to be honest with you. I mean, there are names that you know that are outstanding, highly respected, names that you would know, President. And we'll be looking at them. We'll be looking at some others. But they will come from the list of 25 people. Okay?
Mr. President, it's an election year. Would you give consideration to holding that spot open until the makeup of Congress is determined come November?
I haven't really thought about that. I think you want to go as quickly as possible. It's a process, but haven't really thought of that. But we had a big day yesterday, very big. We had a great decision today in terms of what was just released by the Supreme Court yesterday, obviously, with the travel ban was extremely big. And we had some tremendous elections. South Carolina, from my own standpoint, South Carolina, the governor, McMaster, it was a big win. And as you know, I was very much involved in New York with the Congressman, Donovan. So we're very happy. This was a good few days, and now I get to cap it off by meeting with the president of Portugal. And Portugal's been actually very important to our nation. And you're right, we have about 1.5 million people from Portugal here. So that's very important.
Do you have a message to House Republicans who failed to pass the immigration?
No, I want them to do what they wanted. The problem we have, and I told them this morning, I said, hey, pass it if you can. But I also want them to do what they want. We have a big immigration bill like everybody does, like you're talking, and everybody talks about immigration now, I think, more than ever before. I told them a few hours ago, I said, look, pass something or come back with something that would be a derivation, but get something you want. The problem we have is we need Democratic votes in the Senate, and that's why I don't get overly excited with the House bill right now, because it's not going to pass in the Senate. You're not going to get the Democrats to vote for anything. If we gave them 100% of what they wanted and then doubled it, they still wouldn't pass it because they think it's a good election point. I think it's good for us because I think strong borders. I don't even know how you feel about that, but I think strong borders and no crime that's us. And I think that's going to be a great election point for us. So I told them 2 hours ago, I said, do what you want. And ultimately, we'll come to something, and perhaps it'll be after the election, maybe it'll be before. But as of this moment, Democrats are not going to vote for anything because they really are resisting or obstructing. Okay? Thank you very much. Well, I think we'll be talking about Syria. I think we'll be talking about Ukraine. I think we'll be talking about many other subjects, and we'll see what happens. So you never know. You never know about meetings, what happens, right? But I think a lot of good things can come with meetings with people. We had great meetings with President Xi of China. We have, every place I've been, we have had great meetings. So maybe something positive will come out of it.
What about the progressive challenger to beat Joe Crowley, that young woman from New York? Are you worried about a blue wave?
Well, that was a shocker. Losing for Crowley to lose that election, that was a shocker. I was surprised. Everybody was surprised. We had somebody that's been in there for many years, Mr. President, and I think he probably took it for granted. And I can't say that I'm disappointed because I was never a big fan. But he lost his election. Probably shouldn't have lost his election. Maybe you get a little complacent. That does happen. You get complacent. And he lost. That's a big loss. I tell you what, that was a shocking loss. But it is what it is. Thank you all very much. Thank you. No, they're doing great. By the way, the steel industry is absolutely doing great. The tariffs have been incredible, and the steel industry is doing great, and our country is doing great. You're seeing the results. The numbers coming out from the companies are far beyond what anybody ever thought possible. We're doing really good. But we have to have fair trade deals, and we're working on really fair trade deals. We're working with your representatives on fair trade deals. So
I heard you're going to receive President Juncker. That's good news.
Yes.
That's good news.
Thank you, everybody. They're working. It's going to be very good. It's going to be good.
As far as when you might meet after NATO?
Probably after.
Right after NATO.
Probably after.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much. Could be, or be announced. It'll be announced very soon. Sit down. Listen.
Let's go. Let's keep going.
Thank you.
Sir, let's go.
Very excited because of the justice. Such a big deal.
You've been listening to President Trump address reporters at the White House. He gave more information about Anthony Kennedy's retirement. He said Justice Kennedy did go to the White House to meet with the president. They spent about half an hour talking, and President Trump said he asked the justice for his recommendations for a replacement. They discussed the fact that there is a list of 25 potential candidates that was created during the Trump campaign. Let's bring in Major Garrett, our chief White House correspondent. Major's joining us from the North Lawn of the White House. Major, for our viewers just joining us, tell us a little bit about this list and its origins.
So it started off as a general list of preferences. I can't remember the exact number when it first came out. I think it was like 13, 14, or 15. Then it became a much more defined list of 20. Then there was one name added, 21, in September or October of 2016. And that's when then candidate Trump said, this is my list. And if I'm elected, the person I nominate to fill the seat of Antonin Scalia will come from this list. Judge me, judge my candidacy, and if you will, judge the future of the court based on this list. As he was president, that list grew to 25, and the president reaffirmed that that list is central to his already established vetting process. And when the president in the East Room of the White House, very early in his presidency, before the end of January, announced Neil Gorsuch as his nominee, he described his selection process, justifiably, as the most transparent in American history. Why? Because never before had there been a list. And that list was followed. Neil Gorsuch was on that second list of 20, then 21. So whoever this nominee is, and the president said the process of vetting the next person has begun immediately, I would anticipate that name being put forth within a week or two at the most, is coming from this list of 25. And then, as the president was asked, well, why not wait to have an intervening election? No, we haven't really thought about that. There's not one chance that this White House or the sympathetic and in solidarity Senate Republican leadership will wait. As soon as the nominee is announced, the confirmation process will begin, and you can be absolutely certain there will be a confirmation vote before the midterm elections to fill the seat, now just made vacant by the retirement of Justice Anthony Kennedy.
And we heard the president mention that there are some frontrunners that are very well known. He even said that the president of Portugal may know the names of some of those frontrunners, but gave no further details. Now, on to Russia. The president was asked about the upcoming summit with President Putin of Russia. I'm wondering, Major, how much is Russian interference in the U.S. election going to be hanging over this summit, do you think?
It will hang over it for certain. And when the president was asked, what are you going to talk about? Syria, Ukraine, some other things, another golden opportunity for the president to say something about Russian interference in the 2016 election, thoroughly established. There is a body of evidence that is growing in significance, that there is at the margin some mechanisms by which, using the same tactics, Russians are trying to interfere with the conversation about the 2018 election. Not a word said from the president. There are numerous opportunities. This is just the latest in which he served up on a platter the opportunity to say something. Just recognize it first, criticize it second about Russian interference in American politics. The president, again, let that opportunity lapse and go by the wayside. So whether they discuss it directly or not, it will overhang because it is a serious issue. It's got bipartisan concern. There are numerous ongoing investigations, some of them just technical and tactical. How did it happen? What were the methods? Some of them with potential criminal aspects to them, the Robert Mueller investigation certainly, about this issue. Lots of people have generalized and very sharp concerns about this, and given opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to both note that and to criticize it, President Trump has let almost every one of those opportunities pass him by. What's interesting is it will happen sometime in mid-July on the other side of the president's trip to Belgium for the NATO summit. The two places most likely to be the host, Vienna, Austria, Helsinki, Finland. The people I've talked to believe it's more likely to be in Helsinki, Finland for geographic reasons, ease of the president getting there, ease of President Putin getting there and then getting back to Russia as the World Cup goes on. So can't say for certain, but I would say if you were to have a hunch, Helsinki, Finland would probably be the place this is likely to be.
And the one thing the president did say on the topic of Russia was simply that they're doing a great job with the World Cup. Nothing we heard there about Russian interference. Now, coming back to Justice Kennedy, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said earlier that they'd consider the eventual nominee as early as this fall. What do you make of that timeline, and can Democrats do anything to block this?
They can slow it down a little bit, but they can't block it. That's just a fact. There are some procedural mechanisms by which you can slow things down, gum up the works a little bit. But I guarantee you, if Republicans need to have overnight sessions or weekend sessions just to run out the clock, they'll do it. Whatever is required under Senate procedures to get the hearings held, the vote through the committee, which is the Judiciary Committee, and then the floor vote to have confirmation, Senate Republicans will do it to get this justice on the bench, to replace Kennedy and to have a second Trump person on the Supreme Court, thereby establishing a substantial legacy already before the end of his second year in office, not only on the Supreme Court, but I think Jan made reference to this. If she didn't, I will make the point now. No president in American history has nominated and seen confirmed more appellate justices on the federal bench than President Trump. That is another way in which he is reshaping the federal judiciary, not just at the Supreme Court, but at the appellate courts. And there are lots of Trump nominees that have been submitted and approved for district court positions as well. So already there is a Trump legacy on the federal bench. A second Supreme Court nominee will solidify that legacy even more.
Major, do you think this will embolden the president's policymaking, knowing that 2 of the justices on the bench were handpicked by him?
I think that's something that Democrats will suggest, and you have to wait and see how things shake out. The president and the Supreme Court decision on the travel ban said something that I think was important, separate from who Donald Trump is and what Donald Trump said about immigration policy. The Supreme Court said, long before Donald Trump, the Constitution of the United States invested tremendous authority in the President of the United States and the office of the presidency to deal with immigration policy generally, and very specifically to have wide latitude on questions of immigration policy as they related to national security. The Supreme Court sort of went out of its way to say this was a pre-existing constitutional prerogative of every president. Regardless of who the occupant is now, and regardless of what that occupant said, either as a candidate or as president, this authority has always been there. So the question for the Supreme Court was, did Travel Ban 3.0 fall within that long-established legal authority? The Supreme Court, by a 5-4 narrow majority, I grant you, said yes, it did. So to ask the question, was the president emboldened in the first place? No, he thought he had that problem. He thought he had that power. And it turns out, under the third variation of the travel ban, in fact, he did. If he had tried that on Travel Ban 1 and Travel Ban 2, he would have failed, because the Supreme Court's decision made it pretty clear, though it didn't say so explicitly, neither one of those first 2 travel ban variations would have passed constitutional scrutiny. So that in itself is an example of how the president didn't necessarily feel emboldened by the existing structure of the Supreme Court and had to rework his own policy. So every president has to look at existing law and the way the Supreme Court has historically dealt with cases. And plenty of presidents have learned that just because you nominate and see confirmed on your watch someone on the Supreme Court doesn't mean they're going to be, and it doesn't mean they ought to be, a reliable vote on behalf of your agenda. Lots of presidents have been burned by that, more of them Republican than Democrat in recent times, but that's always something presidents have in the back of their mind. So I'm not sure I would be prepared to say that the president would or would not feel emboldened. My suggestion is Democrats will make that argument, and it'll be up for the voters to decide whether they believe it or not.
Well, Major, thank you so much for that analysis. We'll have
Sure.
much more on this in just a moment. For now, a quick break. You're streaming CBSN.